Hello, welcome to One Cool Thing here at PCMag.com, where we show off the hottest hardware and other products that have come through PC Labs. PC Labs is virtual these days. I'm John Burek, reporting from home, as is my colleague Tom Brandt, one of our hardware analysts. And today we want to talk about the 2020 version of the iMac, the Apple iMac all-in-one. And the interesting irony here is that a big thing about the new iMac is that it has some features that are optimized for working from home, so much so that Tom is reporting to us from the Apple iMac. So you can't see it because it's showing him. But we'll be talking about it and showing off plenty of our photography of it as well, and getting into the little details about it. So Tom, you've had a few days with the iMac, had a few video conferences with it, done some benchmarking on it, and where shall we start? Maybe we'll start with the components of the iMac. That's the big change here. So you've got an i9-based 10th gen Intel iMac on your desk. Can you elaborate a bit on the processor changes that happened in the 2020 iMac?
Yeah, so pretty much every year, Intel and AMD come out with new processors and graphics cards, and Apple usually adds them to the iMac. This year, the iMac got an update with the 10th generation Comet Lake Intel Core processors, and you can choose from either two Core i5s, a Core i7, or as you mentioned, the 10-core Core i9 that we have here powering this machine, which you cannot see because it's in front of me. The key thing to note, other than typical slight advance in processing power, is that all of these chips now that I just mentioned can process 2 instruction threads for each of the cores on the chip. That's called HyperThreading, and it's something that the previous generation did not have except for in 1 or 2 chips. So that means that everyone who buys a new 27-inch iMac, whichever processor you choose, you should be able to benefit from that HyperThreading capability.
That's right, yeah, because I believe with Intel's desktop CPU lineup, last generation, some of the chip families dropped hyperthreading where they traditionally had it. Like some of the i5s and all of the i7s, typically up until I believe 8th gen desktop, supported hyperthreading. With the 9th gen, some of those fell away, and only the i9 supported hyperthreading. So you might have, for instance, an 8-core processor that only supported 8 concurrent processing threads. So it's a pretty big deal, actually, what Apple has done here in terms of bringing hyperthreading back to the line top to bottom. So you have an i9 in your machine over there. So the base model of the iMac, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, $1799 for this 27-inch iMac?
Yes, so the 27-inch iMac version is the one we're talking about. The base price for that is $1,799.
Right, so you've got over $4,000 SKU. So what else was upgraded there? The i9 chip, what else has changed?
Yeah, so basically the difference between our configuration, which is more than $4,000, and the entry-level configuration is, besides the Core i9, is that we have the maxed out graphics card, which is an AMD Radeon Pro that's slightly different from the Radeon Pro Vega that was in last year's iMac. Apple has moved to the latest Radeon Pro based on the RDNA graphics architecture. The most notable thing about the maxed out version, the Radeon Pro 5700 XT, is that it has 16 gigabytes of video memory, which is not the most we've ever seen, but certainly for a device like this is a lot. So that adds to the cost, but then the other main thing that adds to the cost is there's a new Nano Texture matte display option on the 27-inch iMac, which has trickled down from the Apple Pro Display XDR. And basically, this is a $500 option that you can select that will essentially transform the original glossy display that's been on the iMac for a few years into a finish that has a texture, hence the word Nano Texture, that prevents ambient light from hitting the from washing out and adding glare to the screen. Whether or not that's worth $500 to you, it's kind of unfortunate that that's how much it costs. But if you do need that glare reducing finish, it is now available, and it's only the second Apple product, the only one of 2 Apple products now that has that.
Yeah, I know. It was also a pretty big markup on the XDR too, right? Because there was a glossy version and a Nano Texture version. Um,
Yes.
so you mentioned actually when we were talking before this call that it would be ideal to do video on this in the morning as opposed to later in the day because of lighting. So presumably you've got some lighting coming in off your window there. How does the Nano Texture seem to you
So
in terms
yeah,
of the
actually,
capability?
so in this setup right here, I'm very well lit because there's light coming into the room from one direction. That's great for video conferencing, but it actually isn't necessarily the use case for spending the extra $500 on the nano texture because there really isn't any light coming from this direction and hitting the screen. But Apple basically says that anyone who uses the iMac in a room with changing light conditions, which is pretty much any room that has a window, could benefit.
Right, that makes sense. And especially these days when we're working at home morning till night, lighting conditions change. You don't necessarily have the ability to control the lighting in a home unless you're moving things around, from hour to hour, which with a 27-inch all-in-one typically isn't what you do. So I could see how it could make sense for someone who is doing, say, video production work, graphics production work, is working in a place where they want to have their natural lighting and not have to compromise. But yeah, $500, that's the cost of doing business there. So the screen itself is the Retina display. It's like 5120 by, I forget the vertical resolution, 2880, I think. Is that correct?
Yes, it's
That hasn't changed.
slightly customized. Yeah, it's not something we typically see that 5K resolution.
Right. Okay, so that hasn't changed. So the primary change with the display is the nano coding option. Got it.
Yes,
So
and also there's True Tone on this as well, which is Apple's marketing term for automatic white balance adjustment. It's available on the MacBook and MacBook Air as well, and that basically adjusts the white balance of the screen to the ambient light.
got it. How do you find it works? Do you notice it, or is it subtle?
Ideally, you shouldn't notice it, but a few times when the sensor is confused, you will see a bit of flickering. But in general, and you can always turn it off if it does that. In general, it makes things look a little more snazzy, a little more cinematic.
Got it. So yeah, in terms of the display and the other AV capabilities of the new iMac, one of the big things that's changed, as I understand, is the camera. And whether Apple planned it this way or not, given what's going on in the world these days, with a lot of folks working at home and spending their days in Zoom conferences like we are now, the camera's been upgraded in some pretty significant ways. So whether that's a put in quotes happy accident or not, either way, it seems to be very timely. Tom, can you tell us a bit about what's changed with the camera? And since we're looking at you on it, like how are you finding it's different from working on your previous laptop that you were
Yeah,
using?
so basically the new camera on the 27-inch iMac has a 1080p sensor. That means that it can shoot video at a full HD or 1080p resolution at 60 frames per second, which is a vast improvement not only over the previous iMac's camera, but over pretty much every computer with a built-in camera, which they typically have 720p cameras, which just don't look very good. And that's always been the case, but now people are figuring that out as they're doing video conferencing. So that's why we are using this camera to shoot this video. Basically, in addition to the 1080p, the camera also has a new light sensor, which Apple says will eliminate or help reduce the problems of less light coming in when they increase the resolution. That means that in lower light, you should have hopefully just as good, if not better, low light performance that you did with the previous camera. In addition to the camera, there is also I should mention that the camera is basically borrowed from the iMac Pro. The iMac Pro had a 1080p camera from the get-go, and now Apple is bringing it to the regular iMac. They've also brought the microphone system from the 16-inch MacBook Pro to this iMac, and that means that you get a 3-mic array. 2 of them are mounted below the screen, and then the third mic is mounted on the back of the device. And basically that should help reduce ambient noise and identify your voice or whatever source you want to record and make that stand out. And so that's pretty much the benefits of the new mics and the camera.
Got it. Yeah, I was going over some of your notes from you were working on a review of this, of course, as we speak, and some of the notes that you mentioned there about the capabilities of the camera included face detection and how that's different from face recognition, which we see on some Windows webcams. Can you get into that?
Yeah, well, we see face recognition not only on lots of Windows laptops with cameras, but also obviously you have Face ID on the iPhone. The new camera on the iMac does not do any of that. Apple doesn't have any type of face recognition for either its desktops or its laptops. But what the new camera can do is that it now has an algorithm that has been on iPhones and iPads for a couple of years, which is called face detection. And that basically, it just is an algorithm behind the scenes that finds your face in the scene and optimizes the focus and the lighting for your face rather than for the screen wall behind you. And that's something that adds a minor benefit. There's really no hardware involved with that. It's just an algorithm that's operating behind the scenes.
Got it. So it's more about quality of image and focus and things of that sort rather than logging you in or power saving or things like that. That's right? Okay. Cool. So in terms of the audio, what are your impressions of the audio subsystem there? I understand that there is some enhanced audio that's enabled via tuning of the speakers.
Yeah, basically the speakers haven't changed. They're still stereo speakers. But Apple has put their own T2 coprocessor chip into the iMac, and that takes over all of the processing for the audio, the mics, the camera, and also the encryption of the boot drive. What that means for the audio system is that basically it has Apple's own custom designed equalizer, which is a variable equalizer that operates at all volume levels. And so, when you turn it up to the maximum volume level, theoretically, you should experience richer bass at those maximum volume levels. Really, there's not a ton of difference. It still sounds really good. This is definitely way better than laptop speakers. But we have seen some other competing Windows all-in-ones that have sounded even better. One current one is the HP NB32, which has a giant sound bar mounted, integrated into the bottom. That is much better. It has dedicated woofers. And then years ago, Dell had an XPS 27.
Remember that one? Yeah.
That basically had a total of 10 speakers. That obviously was better, but there just isn't a lot of investment in the high-end, large screen all-in-one space. The XPS 27 is no longer available, so really the audio, on this is perfectly good, and it will, if not blow you away, at least entertain you.
Right. Yeah. No, I do remember that 27-inch XPS that you were talking about. I remember us cranking it up in PC Labs and that thing just getting painfully loud to the point where I think it was disturbing people across the floor. So yeah, someone could do a really jazzed up high-end all-in-one one of these days and sort of throw this market on its head. It's kind of ripe for it. I mean, Apple's iMac here is great, but the design is quite a few years old at this point. So one other thing in sort of the details of the configuration that is curious or at least interesting is that there's an option for 10 Gbps Ethernet, which is new here. Could you get into that a little bit?
Yeah, typically an Ethernet port is a gigabit Ethernet port these days. Very few laptops have Ethernet ports anymore. Desktops obviously do. Now, instead of the gigabit Ethernet, which is standard and has been for a while, you can instead opt for 10 gigabit Ethernet, which isn't gonna, typically you're gonna have at most a gigabit download speed from your internet service provider. Moving to 10 gigabits won't change that, but if you have a lot of network activity, if you're working in a photography studio or something like that, and you've got lots of files moving around the network, even a gigabit port could introduce a bottleneck, and so that's apparently a feature that a lot of prosumers need, and so Apple has decided to add it this year.
Yeah, it makes sense in that if you set up a home network or a small office network with the idea of moving around large video files, say in a production environment for video or graphics, that you might want to move things between a whole bunch of Macs, right? And all you need is a 10 Gbps switch and the proper sort of network infrastructure to do it. So that's actually something that sounds more like an iMac Pro feature that's in the straight up iMac now. So interesting
Yeah,
that.
I mean, and the Mac Pro has had multiple Ethernet ports available as well. So, this is kind of bridging the gap there.
Got it. Cool. Yeah, in terms of the other ports, I mean, it's pretty standard stuff. I mean, although unlike the MacBooks, you have USB-A ports on the back of this machine. You could connect your legacy devices. You don't have to get USB-C converters to plug things in. So that remains the same. Is there anything else worthy of note? I know the SD card slot is faster, or is rated for faster cards.
Yeah, there's the ultra high speed standard, which is basically the standard that defines transfer speeds for SD cards. They've added the latest version of that, which is not something that you typically see in a spec list, but it now supports the UHS-2 standard, which is going to involve faster, let you get your images and video off of your SD card, assuming it supports that, faster than before.
Got it. Cool. Yeah, and the other sort of sort of core spec thing, and this is maybe of interest to a subset of buyers, but maybe not many right now, is the wireless networking not being Wi-Fi 6. We're starting to see Wi-Fi 6 in a lot of high-end business and some consumer laptops, but it's not on this. And presumably, you buy an iMac like this, you're going to keep it for a few years. Do you think that's a big deal?
It is a big deal if you're buying a laptop. Because, as you mentioned, it's not as future-proof because Wi-Fi 6 is the future. I'm not as worried about it on the iMac because we have the Ethernet port that we just mentioned, and you can plug that in. It's going to be sitting on your desk. If you really need fast, reliable internet in the future, whatever that may be, run an Ethernet cable.
Got it. Yep, fair enough. So in terms of performance, you've done a bit of testing on this. It's tricky to find comparable benchmarks that will let you directly compare, say, this to a competing Windows 10 all-in-one. But you've done some testing using Cinebench to see how the processor shakes out. I mean, an i9 is an i9, so there'll be a certain amount of score inflation because of that. But what were your overall impressions of testing with, I guess, CPU intensive and the graphics applications that you tried?
Well, I mean, that's really one area where the iMac really stands out and has done for quite a while. As I said, there just aren't that many large screen all-in-ones, and there certainly aren't that many powerful large screen all-in-ones. With a Core i9 and the Radeon Pro that we have, on a task like you mentioned, Cinebench, which is basically rendering a 3D image, the iMac performs really, really well. And that's mainly of note because competing devices like the Microsoft Surface Studio 2 just do not have that amount of computing and graphics horsepower. Even that NV32 that I mentioned earlier, it uses previous generation chips. So for raw performance, if you need it for those CPU intensive tasks, a 10-core Core i9 and an all-in-one, the iMac is one of the only places that you're going to find that.
Got it. Yeah, and also if you're on Mac OS and that is your sort of flow and your production flow, or maybe your colleague's production flow, it's kind of the only game in town anyway, or the iMac or the iMac Pro. Those are your
well, the iMac Pro basically now starts with a 10-core processor. So the entry-level configuration of the iMac Pro and this top-end iMac are roughly the same in terms of theoretical performance. Obviously, the iMac Pro uses a Xeon processor instead of a Core i9, but that's the comparison there.
Right. Also, the other thing, performance-wise, which I don't think we touched on earlier, we talked about SSD capacities. I believe that this comes with a terabyte SSD, and you did some benchmark runs on the boot drive. But what's notable here is that all the SKUs from top to bottom are pure SSD now. There's no more Fusion drive, right?
Yep, and that's one of the things that sets the iMac apart now from Windows competitors like the NV32, which has a combo drive in the base configuration of a solid-state drive, a small solid-state drive, and a larger hard disk drive, which is much slower than just using an SSD.
Well, that said, I mean, I would actually argue that perhaps having the option for a secondary hard drive, might not be a bad thing, depending on your workspace setup and whatnot. I mean, you can always attach a Thunderbolt 3 external if you need more space. But this is a big machine, and probably being able to throw a laptop size, 4 terabyte drive in there would be nice. Do you know anything about the upgradability of this, or is that pretty much a non-starter with this user upgradability?
Yeah, no, you can't really access any of the components. It's sealed shut. That hard disk kind of was the last user accessible component. Now that that's no longer in there, you buy what you get is what you buy is what you get.
Got it. Right. So everything's just going to be an external box or component at this point. Thunderbolt 3, is that on the machine? I assume it is, right? So you could attach,
Yes.
an
Yep,
array.
there are four Thunderbolt. There are many Thunderbolt 3 ports. There are enough Thunderbolt 3 ports that you will not be missing them on the iMac.
Fair enough. So, as I understand, that's right. We were talking about this earlier as well, that the Thunderbolt 3s could also be used for something else, which is chaining off external displays, such as the Pro Display XDR. So you can use that as a video output as well as just a data conduit.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so you could, I believe, run up to 2 Pro Display XDR. Of course, you'll run out of money before you do any of this, but you could conceivably do 2 Pro Display XDRs off this machine.
You could. In order to do that, you do need to upgrade to the highest level Radeon Pro 5700 XT. That enables the support for connecting 2 external 6K displays, which is what the Pro Display XDR is.
Got it. Okay, so you're basically buying an upgraded version of this so you can attach those 2 panels. Well, it's only money at that point, right? I mean, you're already in the hole for 10 grand for the monitors plus the stands, and then the actual upgraded iMac is a mere trifle compared to that, right?
I mean, you could find another 6K monitor. Again, like the iMac, there aren't that many 6K monitors, but it doesn't have to be the Pro Display XDR, but that's the likely use case.
Right, fair enough. Yeah, I mean, I will get back to you on that after I win the New York State lottery. Cool. So anything else you would like to get into on this machine here? I mean, one thing that you had cited when we were discussing this before is that there's sort of a trickle-down effect going on here, right, from other Apple products?
Yeah, don't buy the configuration that we have here, this $4,000, unless you really need that performance. If all you want is a big all-in-one with a really, really nice 5K display and a 1080p camera so your coworkers can see all of your imperfections in your face, just get the entry-level model and maybe think of springing for the extra Nano Texture display if you want to. That will serve you perfectly well. The iMac really is the best option for that, and it's the best option, as you're mentioning, for that overlap zone between the iMac Pro and the prosumer use case. So, pay attention. You don't have to spend $4,000 to get the configuration that would suit you best.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, that's the good thing about this machine is that a lot of the cool stuff in there, so to speak, is standard issue. The display, being the Retina display, the upgraded camera, the SSD only, data storage sort of architecture now, and some of the other stuff. The peripherals presumably also are standard issue, even at the $17.99. So you're getting a pretty high quality machine from the bottom level, and that base model is less than half of what our tester was. So cool. Any other observations on the 2020 iMac you'd like to make before we wrap?
It's great for working from home.
Well, I'll say, you're looking good over there, so I can't argue with the camera. So there we go. Well, great, Tom. Thank you for giving us the rundown. We'll have a full review up shortly on PCMag.com of the 2020 iMac, and looking forward to showing you more cool stuff in the coming days. Thanks very much, folks.